Chris Bishop.
I move that the question be now put.
I call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, Mr Chair, taking up from where my colleague David Clark left off around the impact of this bill on vulnerable workers, this in part two, with the amendment that with the clause that he referred to earlier, this bill also will affect consumers and vulnerable consumers, and I want to specifically refer to a submission from the Barrier Free New Zealand Trust, which is committed to ensuring that the built environment is accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities. And Mr Chair, that this is actually, their submission was quite an important submission, because what they brought home is why it's so important to have good standards. And they talked about consumer confidence, and I want to broaden that out into further consumer confidence. But for this group, they believe that the independence and balance in standards committees was absolutely critical, and that there had to be consumer confidence. And one of the things that really worries us on this side of the House about this bill is that what this bill is doing is moving away from a system where consumers can feel confident. I think we've raised enough issues tonight and through other speeches and other parts of this bill to actually really red flag what has actually being achieved through this bill, which is it's being taken away from being an independent Crown entity. It's being weakened, watered down, and absorbed into a major government department where there is an appearance of independence, but where the extraordinary checks and balances that were in the original entity are not replicated in the new entity. And the Barrier Free New Zealand Trust says that our concern is that should the standards development and approval process be manipulated in any way by virtue of its operational requirements sitting within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, then this would be lost. And I think their submission is actually quite important. I think that if you've got a consumer group that is vulnerable like this, that they should be significantly listened to. And I also want to refer to another submission, which was from the Fire Protection Association. And, you know, this is, you know, a completely different organisation. But what they said was that we are concerned with the very poor quality in thinking and analysis and the lack of even the most rudimentary data evident, MB apparent to our mind, obfuscation of its thinly disguised attempt to use its own words, capture the standard system, either for its own ends or in response to a very influential lobby. And they went on to elaborate on those concerns. Now, when you've got that kind of body saying those kind of things, then there should be major red flags being raised. And in part two, with the disestablishment of the Standards Council, which is going to be replaced by the New Zealand Standards Approval Board, we do not believe that the test has been met for the independence and the probity of the new organisation that will actually ensure, that will provide consumer confidence, that will provide industry confidence, that will alleviate the concerns that have been raised. And another submission, Mr. Chair, and I also refer to Patricia Cunliffe's submission, and where she talked about consumer confidence and consumer concerns and standardisation. And she used some illustrations to to raise the issues of how important it is to continue to develop certain standards. And another one of the concerns that was raised, Mr. Chair.
Claire Curran.
Thank you. Another one of the concerns that was raised is around whether there will be a continuation of the standards being developed that need to be developed to provide that consumer confidence, that industry confidence, and also to maintain our international reputation. And she uses the examples of the standard currently in use for medical alert systems, which is a 20-year-old Australian one, and that there is no willingness by any government department to update the standard as it does not fall neatly into any particular department's bailiwick. Now, Mr. Chair, I ask the Minister and the Chair tonight, will standards like this be updated under the new regime? The second example is from technologies being developed in isolation with insufficient regard to their interaction. And she uses the example that it's known that implanted defibrillators are adversely affected by scanning equipment. Scanning equipment is used not only in airports, it's commonplace, for example, in supermarkets. And the interaction between the two is dealt with warnings rather than by standardisation. So will we have work being done on those things where new technologies are having impacts on people's health and where standards need to be developed? And the third case was in the building sector, where the building code has been developed with insufficient regard for those most at risk, in that there are incompatibilities between the code and NZS 4121, the standard relating to requirements for people with disabilities. Going back to that issue again, the Malatest report, which was access to buildings for people with disabilities from June 2014, considers that lack of leadership and coordination has contributed to missed opportunities, duplication of efforts, inefficiencies and gaps in knowledge. I ask the Minister and the Chair what he has to say about that, and what confidence can he stand up and give this House that consumers and that those sorts of standards will be looked at under this new regime. Just to conclude, Mr. Chair, two devastating events formed the backdrop to this bill, and also to the health and safety reforms before Parliament: the Pike River mine explosion in 2010, which killed 29 miners, and the collapse of the CTV building in February 2011, which killed 115 people. I'd just like to remind everybody that Standards New Zealand was established after a similarly shocking tragedy, which was the 1931 Hawke's Bay earthquake, which had a death toll of 251 people. And following that event, Standards New Zealand was tasked to ensure future such events did not result in the same loss of life. Well, Mr. Chair, I put it to you, Mr. Chair, and to the Minister that this bill is not going to maintain that, is not going to maintain that standard, maintain that level of scrutiny, of independence, of surety for consumers, New Zealand consumers, for industry bodies that are trying to maintain their own reputations and are trying to build economic credibility and build economic development, and also that our international reputation will be affected, will be watered down by the impact of this bill. We therefore cannot support it.
I call